The chandeliers of Haverton House cast their merciless golden light across the ballroom's polished floors, and in that cruel illumination, every flaw became magnified, every deficiency laid bare for society's examining eye. Eleanor Hartley had long since made peace with her position by the tall windows overlooking the garden, where the heavy damask curtains provided a measure of shadow, and the cool glass offered relief from the oppressive heat of 300 bodies in forced gaiety. She stood precisely where wallflowers had stood for generations, close enough to appear part of the festivities, yet distant enough that her absence from the dancing would not disrupt the swirling patterns of silk and satin that moved across the floor like some great, glittering organism from which she had been quietly excluded. 24 years old now, in her 4th season, though her mother had ceased calling it a season and now referred to it with brittle cheer as keeping Eleanor company in town, she had developed the particular stillness of those who have learned that movement only draws unwanted attention to what one lacks. The music swelled, a waltz that sent couples spinning in perfect synchronization, and Eleanor catalogued them with the detached observation that had become her chief entertainment. Miss Pettigrew, golden-haired and dimpled. Her 3rd dance with Lord Ashworth, Lady Caroline Stanhope, whose classical features had inspired more than one amateur poet this season. Miss Rothschild, whose father's fortune rendered her merely pretty face transcendent in the eyes of every second son seeking salvation from debt. Eleanor knew she possessed none of what drew the male eye. Her hair was an indeterminate brown that no amount of artful arrangement could render fashionable, her features regular but unremarkable, her figure neither voluptuously curved nor fashionably willowy, but something disappointingly in between. Too plain for marriage. She had overheard her Aunt Marguerite remark to her mother last season, the words drifting through a partially closed door with the clarity of an executioner's pronouncement. Her mother had not disagreed, had only sighed and said, perhaps a country vicar, or a widower in need of a sensible helpmeet for his children. Eleanor had felt something inside her crystallize at those words, the last soft hopes of girlhood hardening into the brittle armor of acceptance. She had intelligence, she had read extensively, she could converse knowledgeably on subjects that made other young ladies' eyes glaze with incomprehension. But what currency had such qualities in a marriage market where the tender was beauty, youth, and practiced feminine charm? The breeze through the partially opened window carried the scent of roses from the garden below, sweet and somehow mournful, and Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, allowing herself this single moment of something dangerously close to self-pity before straightening her spine and fixing her expression into the pleasant neutrality that had become her social mask. The evening would end as all such evenings ended, her dance card empty save for one dutiful turn with her brother, her parents' disappointment palpable in the carriage ride home, and another night added to the growing collection of evidence that Eleanor Hartley was destined for a quiet life of genteel spinsterhood, a maiden aunt to whichever of her siblings produced children first, her own dreams of partnership and passion filed away like outdated correspondence, acknowledged but no longer actively mourned. The disturbance began as a ripple at the ballroom's entrance, a subtle alteration in the atmosphere that Eleanor registered even from her distant position by the windows, the way one senses an approaching storm before the first clouds appear on the horizon. Conversations faltered mid-sentence, fans paused in their languid arcs, and heads turned with the synchronized precision of a flock of birds changing direction, all attention suddenly fixed upon the tall figure who had just been announced with a formality that bordered on reverence. His Grace, the Duke of Greystone. Sebastian Aldridge entered as he did all things with an economy of movement that suggested both absolute confidence and profound disinterest in the impression he created, though the impression itself was undeniable. He was tall, lean in the way of men who forgot to eat when absorbed in more interesting pursuits, his dark hair unfashionably long and his evening clothes immaculate, yet somehow conveying the sense that he tolerated them rather than took pleasure in their elegance. But it was his face that had earned him his reputation for coldness. Aristocratic features rendered severe by an expression of such studied indifference that it approached disdain, grey eyes that observed the assembled company with the detached interest of a naturalist examining specimens of limited fascination. Eleanor had never been introduced to him, moved as they did in entirely different spheres, but she knew his history as everyone did 32 years old, one of the wealthiest men in England, brilliant by all accounts with interests spanning classical philosophy to modern agriculture, and stubbornly, magnificently unmarried, despite the desperate machinations of every ambitious mother who had presented a daughter for his consideration over the past decade. He attended society functions rarely, and then with such visible reluctance that his presence became noteworthy, precisely for its scarcity, and his departure was typically marked by a collective sigh of relief from those who had spent the evening trying to interpret his silence as either profound thought or cutting judgment. The crowd parted for him as he moved into the ballroom, not with the eager deference shown to popular or charming nobility, but with something closer to wariness, as though they feared contamination from his chill. Lady Pemberton materialized at his elbow with her eldest daughter, the statuesque Miss Amelia Pemberton, whose beauty had been celebrated in verse. Eleanor watched as the Duke inclined his head with mechanical politeness, spoke perhaps 3 words, and managed to convey such absolute disinterest that Lady Pemberton retreated with heightened colour and wounded pride. Mrs. Rothschild attempted next, positioning her daughter in his path with theatrical subtlety. The Duke's grey eyes passed over the girl as though she were part of the room's furniture, notable perhaps for aesthetic contribution, but requiring no personal engagement. One by one, the ambitious mothers tried and failed, their daughters' practiced smiles faltering under the frost of his regard, and Eleanor found herself experiencing an unexpected sympathy for this cold, isolated man who seemed as much a prisoner of his position as she was of hers, though his cage was gilded with gold, where hers was merely painted with the thin veneer of polite inclusion. He had stopped now near the center of the ballroom, apparently content to observe rather than participate, and Eleanor thought she recognized something in his careful stillness, in the way he held himself apart, the same protective distance she herself maintained, the same preemptive retreat from rejection, dressed in the more dignified clothing of choice. Eleanor had perfected the art of invisibility over 4 seasons, the ability to fade into wallpaper and drapery so completely that her presence became merely atmospheric, and so when the Duke of Greystone's grey eyes swept across the ballroom with that particular quality of detached assessment she had observed in his earlier survey of the assembled company, she felt no flutter of anticipation, no foolish hope that his gaze might settle upon her indeed. She was in the process of studying the garden below, contemplating whether she might slip outside for a moment of solitary peace, when she became aware of a disturbance in the social fabric around her, a sudden charged silence that made her turn back toward the ballroom, just in time to see him moving directly toward her position by the windows, his stride purposeful in a way that his earlier meandering had not been, and the shock of recognition that she was his destination struck her with the force of physical impact. He stopped before her with mathematical precision, neither too close nor too distant, and bowed with a formality that belonged to an earlier, more rigid age. "Miss Hartley," he said, his voice low and without inflection, "would you do me the honor of this dance?" The ballroom had not fallen completely silent. That would have been too theatrical, too obvious, but Eleanor could feel the weight of 300 pairs of eyes upon them, could sense the sudden suspension of conversations, the redirection of attention toward this incomprehensible development, and her first coherent thought was that he had mistaken her for someone else, that he had confused her with one of the more notable young ladies, and would realize his error with mortifying swiftness. "I believe you are mistaken, Your Grace," she said quietly, offering him the escape of misidentification, but his expression did not change, did not register either confusion or correction. "I am not mistaken," he replied with the same flat certainty he might have used to state a mathematical proof. "Miss Eleanor Hartley, daughter of Sir Richard Hartley, you are she, and I am requesting this dance." There was no warmth in his face, no hint of the admiration or interest that typically accompanied such requests. Indeed, there was nothing in his demeanor to explain this extraordinary choice, and Eleanor found herself suspended between bewilderment and the first stirrings of something uncomfortably close to humiliation, the terrible suspicion that she had become the object of some incomprehensible aristocratic whim, a wager perhaps, or worse, an act of charitable condescension. But her pride, that stubborn core of dignity that had sustained her through 4 seasons of rejection, would not permit her to refuse and create a scene that would mark her as graceless as well as plain, and so she placed her gloved hand in his extended one and allowed him to lead her onto the floor just as the orchestra began the opening strains of a waltz. And if she had felt invisible before, she now felt searingly, unbearably visible, aware of every whisper, every incredulous stare, every speculation that followed them onto the dance floor like a wake of disturbed water behind a passing ship. His hand settled at her waist with correct but impersonal pressure. His other hand held hers with the same detached precision, and they began to move through the figures of the waltz in complete silence, his face as expressionless as a marble statue, his grey eyes fixed somewhere past her left shoulder, and Eleanor felt the music flow around them without touching them, felt the mechanical nature of their movements, proper and perfectly executed, but utterly devoid of the grace that came from genuine partnership. And she thought wildly that they must appear as awkward as she felt, two wooden figures moving through rehearsed motions, though when she caught a glimpse of them in one of the ballroom's gilt mirrors, she saw that they looked, if anything, merely formal, correctly matched in their movements if not their understanding. She wanted to demand an explanation, wanted to ask what game he played and why he had chosen her as his instrument, but the dance required all her concentration. She had so little practice, after all, and his closed expression offered no invitation to inquiry, and so they completed the waltz in that terrible silence, her heart beating hard, not with pleasure but with confused distress. And when the final notes faded, he released her immediately, stepped back, executed another of those rigid bows, murmured, "Thank you, Miss Hartley," with no more emotion than if he thanked a servant for bringing him tea, and then he turned and walked away, leaving her standing alone in the center of the dance floor, bewildered and inexplicably wounded, while all around her society began to whisper and speculate about what they had just witnessed, and Eleanor, who had learned to disappear, now found herself the focus of an attention far more uncomfortable than neglect had ever been. The morning after the Pemberton ball arrived with leaden clouds and the first whisper of summer rain, and Eleanor woke to discover that she had become, through no action or desire of her own, the subject of intense and uncomfortable speculation throughout London society, a transformation as bewildering as it was unwelcome. Her mother appeared at breakfast with an expression Eleanor had not seen in 3 years, bright, calculating interest, and announced that no fewer than 4 calling cards had already been delivered before 9 o'clock, an unprecedented occurrence in a household where visitors had become increasingly rare as Eleanor's prospects dimmed with each passing season. "The Duke of Greystone," her mother said, handling the topic with the delicacy of one approaching a skittish horse, "is known to be most particular in his attentions. One must wonder what prompted such marked distinction." The unspoken question hung between them like morning mist. Why you? Eleanor had no answer, could offer nothing but the same bewildered confusion that had kept her awake through the long hours of darkness, replaying that silent waltz, searching for meaning in the Duke's expressionless face and finding nothing but her own reflected incomprehension. Her younger sister Caroline, safely engaged to a respectable gentleman and therefore free to speak with the casual cruelty of the secure, voiced what Eleanor knew others would be whispering in drawing rooms throughout Mayfair. Perhaps it was a wager. Lord Ashford is known to make the most extraordinary bets, and the Duke is in his circle. Or perhaps, she paused with theatrical consideration, it was an act of charity, a gesture of Christian kindness toward the less fortunate. The words struck with the precision of carefully aimed arrows, and Eleanor felt something harden in her chest, a familiar protective shell reforming around the vulnerable places that had briefly, foolishly, entertained the possibility that the Duke's attention had meant something other than incomprehensible, aristocratic whim. When she ventured out that afternoon for her customary walk in the park, an activity she had always undertaken with the blessed anonymity of the overlooked, she found herself the object of covert glances and barely concealed whispers, ladies inclining their heads together as she passed, their fans rising to shield mouths that shaped her name, and the Duke's with equal measures of disbelief and speculation. Mrs. Thornbury, who had not acknowledged Eleanor's existence in 2 full seasons, stopped her carriage to offer honeyed words about what a lovely couple they had made on the dance floor, though her eyes held the sharp gleam of one searching for weakness, for the flaw that would explain this inexplicable development. Most disturbing of all was the sudden appearance of gentlemen who had previously looked through her as though she were constructed of glass. Mr. Fitzwilliam requested permission to call. Lord Ashford's younger brother engaged her in conversation about the weather with an earnestness that bordered on comedy, and even the insufferable Mr. Pemberton, who had once described her in her hearing as regrettably plain, inquired with transparent casualness whether she would be attending Lady Morrison's musical the following week. They approached her not with genuine interest, Eleanor understood with bitter clarity, but with the cautious curiosity of men who wondered if the Duke of Greystone had perceived some hidden value they had overlooked, some quality invisible to ordinary eyes but apparent to his superior discernment, and the humiliation of being suddenly visible only because a more important man had briefly noticed her was in some ways more painful than the years of being invisible had been. By week's end, Eleanor had heard herself described as the Duke's charitable project, as the subject of some obscure aristocratic experiment, and most cutting of all, as proof that even the coldest men sometimes perform acts of inexplicable pity, and she determined with the fierce pride that was perhaps her only genuine wealth that she would forget the entire incident, would return to her comfortable invisibility, and would refuse absolutely to allow herself to wonder about grey eyes and unexplained waltzes and the terrible, treacherous hope that perhaps, impossibly, it had meant something more. A week of determined avoidance had passed, during which Eleanor declined social invitations with the excuse of a mild indisposition and spent her days in the quiet refuge of books and solitary walks, attempting to reconstruct the comfortable invisibility that had been her protection and her prison, and it was during one such escape that she found herself at the British Museum on a Wednesday afternoon when fashionable society was occupied elsewhere, standing before the Elgin marbles in a gallery blessedly empty, save for two elderly scholars arguing in hushed tones about provenance in the far corner. The marble figures rose before her with their damaged grace, bodies frozen in eternal motion, and she stood contemplating the Parthenon frieze with its procession of draped figures, finding something profoundly peaceful in their ancient silence. In the way they had existed for millennia without concern for the opinions of London society, and she was so absorbed in tracing the flow of carved drapery with her eyes that she did not hear footsteps approaching until a voice behind her said with startling clarity, "The paradox is that they appear more alive in their incompleteness than they might have in perfection." Eleanor turned sharply and found herself facing the Duke of Greystone, who stood at a respectful distance with his hands clasped behind his back, his grey eyes fixed not upon her but upon the marble frieze, and her first instinct was flight, an overwhelming desire to escape before this incomprehensible situation could extend itself further. But something in his stance, the way he appeared genuinely absorbed in contemplation rather than in her, kept her rooted in place. "Your Grace," she said carefully, offering the minimum courtesy required, and he inclined his head in acknowledgement but did not shift his gaze from the sculptures, as though her presence were unremarkable, as though they were merely two individuals who happened to share an interest in classical antiquity rather than the subject of a week's worth of speculation and gossip. The missing pieces allow the imagination to complete them, Eleanor found herself saying, drawn despite her wariness into the observation he had begun, and perhaps what we imagine is more vital than what the sculptor actually created. Now he did look at her, and for the first time since their silent waltz, she saw something flicker in those carefully controlled eyes, surprise perhaps, or recognition. "You argue that incompleteness is superior to wholeness?" he asked, not with challenge but with genuine curiosity, the same tone one scholar might use with another, and Eleanor felt something shift in the space between them, a movement from the personal into the realm of ideas, where she had always felt most certain. "I argue that perfection can be static," she replied, emboldened by the intellectual nature of the exchange, "while imperfection invites participation, demands that the observer bring themselves to the work and complete it with their own understanding." They stood in silence for a moment, both regarding the frieze, and Eleanor was acutely aware that this conversation bore no resemblance to the painful formality of their dance, that something genuine was passing between them for the first time, an exchange of actual thoughts rather than social performance. "Miss Hartley," he said finally, turning to face her fully, and his expression was still controlled but no longer entirely blank, "I wonder if I might request permission to call upon you and your family." The question landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples of confusion and alarm through Eleanor's fragile peace, and she felt her protective walls rising instinctively, the suspicion that she was still somehow the object of an incomprehensible game. "I cannot imagine why you would wish to do so, Your Grace," she said with a directness that bordered on rudeness, but he did not flinch from it, did not retreat into aristocratic offense. "Because in a ballroom full of performances," he replied quietly, "you spoke the truth about damaged marble, and I find I have had quite enough of performances." Then he bowed, more briefly than formality required, and walked away before she could form a response, leaving her standing alone before the ancient stones, her heart beating with something that was not quite hope, but was no longer entirely resignation, and wondering with vertiginous uncertainty whether she had just witnessed the beginning of something genuine or merely a more sophisticated version of the incomprehensible attention that had plagued her for a week. The Duke of Greystone arrived at the Hartley residence on Thursday afternoon precisely at 3 o'clock, announced by the butler with a gravity that suggested he were heralding royalty rather than a social call, and Eleanor watched from the drawing-room window as his perfectly appointed carriage drew to a halt, noting the way her mother's hands fluttered to her hair and her father straightened his waistcoat with uncharacteristic nervousness, the air itself seeming to vibrate with barely suppressed excitement at this unprecedented elevation of their household's social standing. When Sebastian entered the drawing-room, he brought with him that same quality of controlled reserve she had observed at the ball, his movements precise and formal, his bow to her parents executed with exactitude, and Eleanor felt the familiar weight of performance settling over the gathering like a heavy curtain, transforming what might have been a simple visit into an elaborate theatrical production in which everyone knew their lines had tremendous importance, but no one was entirely certain of the script. Her mother served tea with hands that trembled slightly, chattering about the weather and the season and the quality of the roses this year with the desperate brightness of one trying to fill silence before it could become awkward, while her father adopted an expression of benevolent authority that sat uncomfortably on features more accustomed to mild worry about household accounts. Sebastian accepted tea he did not drink, responded to pleasantries with appropriate but minimal replies, and maintained throughout an air of such stiff propriety that Eleanor found herself wondering if she had imagined the genuine conversation at the museum, if that moment of intellectual connection had been merely a brief aberration in an otherwise impenetrable facade. It was her father who finally, clearing his throat with purpose, suggested that perhaps the Duke might enjoy seeing Eleanor's watercolors in the morning room, a transparent ploy to provide them some measure of privacy, and Eleanor led Sebastian from the drawing-room with the creeping sensation that she was walking toward something irrevocable, though what that might be she could not name. In the relative quiet of the morning room, with her mediocre landscapes arranged on the walls as though they possessed some merit worth displaying, Sebastian turned to face her fully and said with careful formality, "Miss Hartley, I wonder if you have given thought to our conversation at the museum," and she replied with equal care that she had thought of little else, though she remained uncertain as to its meaning or his intentions. He moved to examine her paintings with what appeared to be genuine interest, pausing before a rendering of the lake at her uncle's estate, and said quietly, "You paint what you observe, not what is fashionable to paint," which she could not determine was compliment or criticism until he added, "I find that quality increasingly rare and increasingly valuable." Then he turned to face her with an expression that was not quite vulnerable, but was no longer entirely armored, and requested permission to escort her to upcoming events, to continue their acquaintance in a more formal capacity, to explore whether the understanding they had briefly achieved might be cultivated into something more substantial, and Eleanor heard herself agreeing despite every instinct of self-preservation that warned her against hoping, against trusting, against believing that the Duke of Greystone could possibly see in plain Eleanor Hartley anything worth such devoted attention, and as he took his leave with proper formality and a glance that lingered perhaps a moment longer than strictly necessary, she wondered with equal measures of terror and trembling possibility whether she was being courted or merely studied, whether this was the beginning of something genuine or simply a more elaborate performance than any she had witnessed before. The weeks that followed assumed a quality of surreal theater that left Eleanor perpetually disoriented, as though she had stepped through a looking-glass into a world where all the rules that had governed her existence had been quietly rewritten without her consultation, and it began at the Pemberton Ball, where Sebastian appeared at her side within minutes of her arrival, and claimed not one but 3 dances on her card, his elegant script transforming the empty ivory pages into a declaration that society could not ignore, and she felt the weight of 100 eyes upon them as they moved through a quadrille with the same formal precision that had characterized their first waltz, though now there was something almost comfortable in their shared silence, as though they had agreed without words that they need not perform conversation for the benefit of observers. Within a fortnight, his presence at every event she attended had become so reliable that her mother began consulting his known schedule when deciding which invitations to accept, and Eleanor found herself the unlikely center of attention she had spent 4 seasons carefully avoiding. Her dance card, that annual document of her social failure, now bearing not only Sebastian's name in multiple slots, but also the names of other gentlemen who suddenly discovered her worthy of notice, as though the Duke's attention had bestowed upon her some previously invisible quality that rendered her visible to eyes that had looked through her for years. Mr. Pemberton, who had never once acknowledged her existence, requested a country dance and spoke with great earnestness about his admiration for intelligent women, while Lord Ashworth's second son, who had openly mocked her plain appearance the previous season, now found occasions to promenade with her in Hyde Park and praise the understated elegance of her manner, and Eleanor received these attentions with a bewilderment that bordered on anger, understanding with perfect clarity that she had not changed, that nothing about her appearance or character was different from what it had been when these same gentlemen had dismissed her as beneath their notice, and the realization that her worth in their eyes derived entirely from Sebastian's inexplicable interest made her feel simultaneously elevated and diminished, valued and invisible. At the Marchmont Musicale, Sebastian arrived late and made his way directly to her side despite the performance already underway, settling into the chair beside her with a murmured apology that drew disapproving glances from those who valued propriety over precedence. And she felt the warmth of his presence like a physical thing, solid and undeniable, and wondered with increasing desperation what game he was playing and what rules governed it, whether this extraordinary attention would evaporate as mysteriously as it had begun and leave her more isolated than before, or whether something genuine underlay the careful formality of their public interactions. When the soprano concluded her aria and the audience shifted for interval refreshments, Sebastian offered his arm and guided her toward the terrace, where the June evening spread soft and fragrant, and she gathered her courage to ask the question that had haunted her through 3 weeks of unprecedented attention. But before she could speak, he said quietly, his eyes fixed on the darkening garden rather than on her face, "I realize my presence may be complicating your season, Miss Hartley, and I wonder if you wish me to withdraw." And the vulnerability beneath the formal words struck her with unexpected force, the suggestion that he too felt uncertain, that this strange dance they were performing had no clear steps for either of them, and she found herself answering with a honesty that surprised her. "I wish only to understand what this is, Your Grace, for I confess I am entirely at sea." And in the gathering dusk, she thought she saw him smile, brief and almost sad, before he replied, "As am I, Miss Hartley, as am I." The confrontation came at the Westbury garden party on a late June afternoon, when the roses hung heavy with perfume and the heat lay thick upon the assembled guests, and Eleanor found herself at the limits of her endurance with confusion and half-answers, and the terrifying suspension of not knowing whether the ground beneath her feet was solid or simply another illusion that would dissolve and leave her falling. And when she saw Sebastian standing alone near the hedge maze, his profile stark against the green, she felt something harden in her chest and propel her forward with a determination that overrode every instinct of propriety and caution, and she approached him directly, without preamble, and said in a low voice that trembled only slightly, "Your Grace, I must know your purpose," and watched his shoulders stiffen as though she had struck him, his eyes when they met hers containing something almost like panic before the familiar mask of cool reserve settled back into place. He began to offer some formal deflection, some carefully constructed response about the pleasure of her company, but she interrupted with uncharacteristic boldness, the words tumbling forth with all the accumulated frustration of weeks spent suspended in uncertainty. "I am not a fool, despite what society may believe about plain women, and I will not continue this peculiar dance without understanding what music we are meant to be following, for I cannot determine if I am being courted or studied like one of your museum pieces, and I will not be made a spectacle for purposes I cannot fathom." And the raw honesty of her declaration seemed to strip something away from him, peeling back the layers of ducal composure to reveal something underneath that was startlingly human and unmistakably wounded. For a long moment he simply looked at her, and she saw his jaw tighten as though he were physically restraining words that wanted to escape. And then he said quietly, each word carefully measured, "I tire of performances, Miss Hartley." And the weariness in his voice was so profound that she felt it in her own bones. "I have spent my entire life surrounded by people who perform, who smile and flatter, and calculate every word for maximum advantage, who see in me only a title and a fortune, and an opportunity for advancement, who would say anything and be anyone if it might secure their position." And his eyes, when they locked with hers, held something fierce and almost desperate. "You, Miss Hartley, do not perform. You do not calculate. You do not transform yourself into whatever you believe. I wish to see you are simply, honestly, entirely yourself. And you cannot possibly understand how rare that is, how valuable, how desperately I—" But he stopped abruptly, as though realizing he had ventured too close to some precipice, and the vulnerability that had flickered across his features vanished beneath renewed reserve, and he stepped back with a formal bow that re-established all the distance between them, saying with forced composure, "Forgive me, I have said too much. I should not have." And before she could respond, before she could reach for that glimpse of genuine feeling he had inadvertently revealed, he had turned and walked away toward the main gathering, leaving her standing alone by the hedge maze with her heart pounding and her mind racing, understanding for the first time that perhaps his mystery was not indifference but its opposite, not coldness, but an excess of feeling so carefully controlled that it appeared as ice, and the possibility that the Duke of Greystone might be as frightened and uncertain as she was, transformed everything she thought she understood about their strange, tentative connection. The days following the garden party encounter found Eleanor in a state of restless curiosity that would not be satisfied by speculation alone, and she discovered within herself a determination to understand the man who had so thoroughly disrupted her settled expectations, for his words by the hedge maze had revealed depths she had not anticipated and sparked questions that demanded answers. And so she began with careful discretion to inquire into Sebastian Aldridge's history, asking her cousin Margaret, who knew everyone's business, mentioning casually to her mother's friend Lady Thornbury that she had heard the Duke was once engaged, observing conversations at tea parties where the older matrons spoke of families they had known for decades, and gradually, piece by careful piece, a picture emerged that transformed her understanding entirely. Sebastian's childhood, she learned from Lady Thornbury's surprisingly sympathetic account, had been marked by a coldness that made his current reserve seem almost warm by comparison, for his mother, the late Duchess, had been a woman of extraordinary beauty and equally extraordinary vanity, who measured worth entirely by appearances and social position, who had displayed her handsome son like a prized possession while remaining utterly indifferent to his actual nature. And his father, the old Duke, had been a man of rigid propriety and exacting standards, who valued duty and dignity above all human warmth. And between these two forces, Sebastian had been shaped like iron in a forge, taught that feeling was weakness, and that the only safety lay in perfect, impenetrable control. The broken engagement came later. Margaret confided over tea in the Hartley drawing room, her voice dropping to a whisper as she recounted what she knew of Lady Arabella Winters, a diamond of the first water 6 years past, whose beauty had been celebrated in sonnets, and whose pursuit of the young Duke had been relentless and ultimately successful, for Sebastian at 26 had apparently believed himself in love and had offered for her hand with a sincerity that shocked those who knew his usual reserve, only to discover 3 weeks before their wedding that Arabella had been conducting a simultaneous flirtation with Lord Carrington and had told her confidant within Sebastian's hearing, though she did not know he was present, that she found the Duke intolerably dull, but his fortune and position more than compensated for the tedium of his company, and Margaret's eyes were soft with sympathy as she described how Sebastian had ended the engagement with perfect formality and then withdrawn almost entirely from society, appearing thereafter only when duty absolutely demanded, and maintaining such icy distance that even the most ambitious mothers eventually ceased presenting their daughters for his consideration. Eleanor absorbed these revelations with a growing ache in her chest, understanding now the source of his careful walls and his suspicion of performance, recognizing in his history a mirror of her own experience of being valued or not valued for qualities that had nothing to do with her essential self. And she thought of his words about authenticity and rarity, and began to comprehend that what had drawn him to her was precisely what society dismissed, that her inability to be other than herself was not the liability she had always believed, but rather the quality he had been seeking without knowing where to find it. And this understanding shifted something fundamental in how she saw their strange connection, transforming it from incomprehensible puzzle to tentative beginning, and she found herself hoping with an intensity that frightened her that perhaps two people wounded by similar betrayals might find in each other not just recognition, but genuine refuge. The turning point came at Whitmore Hall in early July, where both Eleanor and Sebastian found themselves among the guests invited for a week-long house party in the countryside, and though they had exchanged polite greetings upon arrival and observed each other across crowded drawing rooms, they had not spoken privately since that charged encounter by the hedge maze, and Eleanor felt the weight of her new knowledge about his history, pressing against every interaction, seeing now in his careful reserve, not coldness but old wounds imperfectly healed. And on the third day of the party, a summer storm rolled in with dramatic suddenness, sending guests scattering from the lawn games and outdoor pursuits, and Eleanor, seeking refuge from the forced gaiety and suffocating company, slipped away to Whitmore's extensive library, believing herself alone in that sanctuary of leather and paper and blessed silence. The rain hammered against the tall windows with a fury that matched something restless in her own chest, and she had just selected a volume of poetry when she heard a sound from the far corner and turned to discover Sebastian standing by the window, watching the storm with an expression she had never seen on his face before, something unguarded and melancholy and achingly human. And for a moment they simply looked at each other, and then he said quietly, "I did not mean to intrude on your solitude," but made no move to leave, and she found herself saying with equal quietness, "Nor I on yours." And yet neither of them departed, and instead she moved to stand near the window, not quite beside him but close enough that the space between them felt charged with possibility, and they watched the rain together in silence until he spoke again, his voice low and almost hesitant. "Do you ever feel, Miss Hartley, that you are utterly alone even in rooms full of people? That you might vanish entirely and no one would notice the absence, only the gap where a title or a fortune or a useful connection had been?" And the raw vulnerability in the question took her breath, and she answered with matching honesty, "Every day of my life, Your Grace." And then, abandoning caution, added, "Until recently, when someone looked at me and appeared to see something beyond what I was not beautiful, not charming, not whatever it is that makes other women valuable, and I cannot determine if that was real or if I imagined it, because I wanted so desperately for it to be true." He turned from the window then, and his eyes, when they met hers, held such intensity that she felt pinned by it, and he said, "It was real." And then, as though a dam had broken, the words spilled forth, "I have spent my life being valued for everything but myself, for my title, my wealth, my position, for what I could provide or elevate or legitimize, and I learned to protect myself by remaining distant, by revealing nothing that could be exploited or manipulated or used against me, and it made me safe, but it also made me unspeakably lonely. And then I saw you at that ball, standing apart with a book you had half hidden behind your fan, reading poetry while everyone else performed their elaborate dances of ambition, and you looked so honestly yourself, so utterly without pretense, and I thought perhaps here is someone who might understand what it is to be perpetually unseen." And Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes as she recognized in his confession the mirror of her own experience, and she reached out without thinking and touched his hand where it rested on the window frame and said softly, "I see you." And he turned his hand to clasp hers, and they stood there while the storm raged outside, and something equally transformative, but infinitely more welcome, began between them. The first genuine warmth kindling in the space where fear and isolation had reigned, and neither spoke for a long time, simply holding to that connection as though it were an anchor in uncertain seas, understanding that they had found in each other something both of them had believed impossible: recognition, Acceptance, the beginning of genuine refuge. As autumn arrived and London prepared for the little season, the connection between Eleanor and Sebastian deepened into something that neither quite dared to name, but both increasingly felt in every moment they spent together. For after Whitmore Hall something had shifted fundamentally, and the careful distance that had characterized their earlier interactions gave way to a tentative but growing intimacy that manifested in 100 small ways that would have been unremarkable to observers, but which carried profound significance to two people unaccustomed to genuine connection. They walked together in the parks during the golden afternoon light, their conversations stretching from philosophy to poetry to observations on human nature, and Sebastian began to share opinions he had kept locked away for years, while Eleanor discovered a wit in herself that his appreciation called forth. And more than once, she made him laugh a genuine, surprised sound that transformed his usually severe features into something startlingly warm. And each time it happened, she felt absurdly triumphant, as though she had achieved something rare and precious. He brought her books with passages carefully marked in his precise hand, annotations in the margins that revealed his thoughts, and she responded in kind, returning them with her own notes, creating a private dialogue that continued beyond their meetings. And once he wrote beside a particularly moving verse, "This made me think of our conversation about authenticity," and her heart had stuttered at the intimacy of being remembered so specifically, of occupying space in his thoughts when they were apart. The physical distance between them diminished incrementally as well, never improper, but increasingly familiar, his hand at her elbow as they navigated uneven ground during a country walk, steady and warm even through the fabric of her sleeve, or the way they stood close enough in galleries that their shoulders nearly touched as they examined paintings. And once, when she stumbled slightly on a loose stone, he caught her with both hands at her waist, and for a breathless moment they stood frozen, his eyes dark and intense on hers, before propriety reasserted itself, and they continued walking, though Eleanor felt the ghost of that touch for hours afterward. She bloomed under his attention like a plant, finally receiving sunlight after years in shadow, discovering that she was not so plain when reflected in eyes that valued what they saw, and she caught herself taking more care with her appearance, not to transform herself, but to present her best authentic self, wearing colors she truly liked rather than what was fashionable, and the increased confidence showed in how she carried herself, in the directness of her gaze and the readiness of her smile. Sebastian's legendary coldness thawed progressively in her presence, the severe lines of his face softening when he saw her enter a room, and the sharp edge of disdain that had characterized his interactions with society became merely polite distance, except when speaking with her, when something genuine and unguarded would surface briefly before he caught himself, and she began to understand that his reserve was not natural temperament, but learned protection, armor, he was slowly, carefully beginning to remove in the safety of her company. Yet for all this growing closeness, neither spoke the words that might define what was forming between them, both perhaps too accustomed to disappointment to risk naming hope, both waiting for some sign from the other that would justify vulnerability. And so the autumn weeks passed in this state of suspended possibility, intimate and distant at once, a relationship that felt monumental in its significance to them both, while appearing to observers merely as a prolonged and oddly matched courtship, and Eleanor found herself suspended between contentment in what they shared and yearning for something more, something neither had yet found courage to claim. The proposal came in late October, when the leaves had turned to copper and gold, and the air carried that peculiar crispness that speaks of summer's definitive end, and Sebastian requested a formal interview with Eleanor's father on a Tuesday morning, arriving at the Hartley townhouse with a gravity of purpose that made the butler straighten instinctively and announce him with unusual solemnity. And Mr. Hartley received him in his study with barely concealed anticipation, for even that practical man had observed the Duke's consistent attentions over the past months and understood what such a request might signify. The interview lasted perhaps 20 minutes, during which Sebastian made his offer with the precision of someone conducting important business, spoke of his estate and income, of the settlements he proposed, which were so generous that Mr. Hartley blinked twice in succession, of his respect for Eleanor and his belief that they would suit admirably, and every word was correct and proper and entirely appropriate, and Mr. Hartley agreed with an alacrity that might have been unseemly in a man less overwhelmed by the prospect of his perpetually unmarried daughter becoming a duchess, and when Sebastian emerged from the study his expression revealed nothing, though his hands were not entirely steady as he requested that Miss Hartley might grant him a private audience in the drawing-room. Eleanor entered to find him standing by the window in that way he had, backlit and somehow separate, and her heart hammered against her ribs with such force she felt certain he must hear it. And he turned as she closed the door and for a moment simply looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch, and then he crossed the room with measured steps and took her hand with a formality that was somehow at odds with the way his thumb brushed once across her knuckles, and he said, "Miss Hartley, Eleanor, I have spoken with your father and received his blessing to ask for your hand in marriage," and the words, though expected, still sent a shock through her system, and he continued, his voice low and controlled, but with something urgent beneath the careful surface. "I believe we would deal remarkably well together. You and I, we understand each other in ways that I have found rare to the point of miraculous, and I can offer you position and security and freedom to pursue your intellectual interests, and I would endeavor to be a husband who values what you are rather than lamenting what you are not." And it was a speech clearly prepared, each word chosen with care, and it contained so much respect, compatibility, understanding, partnership, and yet the one word she suddenly desperately wanted to hear was notably, achingly absent, for he spoke of everything except love, and some part of her wanted to ask directly if affection might grow between them, or if this was to be merely a meeting of compatible minds. But fear sealed her throat, because what if the answer was the latter? What if this was all he could offer? And was she prepared to refuse it simply because she wanted more, wanted everything, when she had long ago resigned herself to nothing? She looked at his face, at the careful control that did not quite hide the tension in his jaw or the vulnerability in his eyes as he awaited her answer, and she thought of the months they had spent together, of the warmth that had grown between them like something fragile and precious, and she thought that perhaps companionship and respect and intellectual partnership were not everything, but they were far more than most marriages contained, certainly more than she had ever expected to find, and she told herself that it would be enough, that she could be content with what he offered without reaching for what he had not promised, and so she said, her voice only slightly unsteady, "Yes, Your Grace, Sebastian, I will marry you," and watched something like relief crash across his features before the careful control reasserted itself, and he raised her hand to his lips in a gesture that was formally correct, but lingered just a moment longer than propriety required, and thus they were engaged, and Eleanor tried to ignore the small voice in her heart that whispered of wanting more than sufficiency, more than contentment, wanting to be loved with the same intensity with which she increasingly feared she loved him. The announcement of the engagement appeared in the Morning Post on a grey November morning and sent ripples through London society that manifested in drawing rooms and ballrooms as a peculiar mixture of envy, confusion, and barely concealed schadenfreude, for the match between the notoriously cold Duke of Greystone and the perpetually overlooked Eleanor Hartley defied every expectation and satisfied none of the romantic narratives that the Ton preferred, and within hours the speculation began in earnest. Some whispered that the Duke had finally succumbed to pressure to produce an heir and had chosen a plain, grateful wife who would not make emotional demands. Others suggested with malicious creativity that perhaps Miss Hartley possessed some hidden talent or fortune that was not immediately apparent, while still others simply waited with vulture-like patience for the match to reveal itself as the mistake they were certain it must be, for surely such an ill-matched pair in terms of rank and appearance could not possibly find happiness, and the general consensus seemed to be that they would watch this peculiar union with great interest to see precisely how and when it would fail. Eleanor's mother, oblivious to or perhaps willfully ignoring these undercurrents, threw herself into wedding preparations with a fervor that might have been touching had it not been so overwhelming, planning an elaborate ceremony that seemed designed to prove to all of society that her daughter had indeed captured a duke and would be married with all the pomp that such a triumph deserved, and she descended upon modistes and florists and caterers with lists and demands, while Eleanor sat through endless fittings and consultations, feeling increasingly like a doll being dressed for display rather than a bride preparing for marriage. And with each passing day, the wedding transformed from an intimate union into a grand performance. precisely the kind of society spectacle that she knew Sebastian despised. Indeed, Sebastian grew progressively more reserved as the engagement period continued, his earlier warmth retreating behind the familiar mask of ducal coldness whenever they were surrounded by the machinery of wedding preparation or the watchful eyes of society, and Eleanor observed with growing unease how he stiffened when her mother discussed the guest list that had swelled to include seemingly half of London, how his jaw tightened when his own family members made pointed comments about duty and lineage and the importance of appropriate behavior for a duchess, and she began to recognize in these moments the shadow of his parents' influence, the weight of expectations that had shaped him into someone who had learned to hide everything genuine behind propriety and reserve. She found herself watching him during social calls and engagement celebrations, seeing how he performed the role of satisfied bridegroom with technical perfection, but without any of the warmth that had characterized their private moments, and a cold fear began to grow in her chest, that perhaps they were indeed repeating the pattern of his parents' marriage, that perhaps the intimacy they had built would not survive the weight of society's expectations and family obligations, that they would become like so many aristocratic couples. She had observed polite strangers sharing a title and a house but nothing of genuine substance. The dinners with his family were particularly revealing and disturbing, for the Dowager Duchess regarded Eleanor with a cold assessment that found her wanting in every particular except malleability, making pointed comments about how a duchess must conduct herself and maintaining the dignity of the Greystone name. And Eleanor watched Sebastian retreat further with each criticism, becoming more remote and formal, as though demonstrating to his mother that he understood the rules, that he would not embarrass the family with unseemly displays of affection or by treating his plain wife as though she were somehow special. In private moments, which grew increasingly rare amid the whirlwind of preparation, Eleanor wanted desperately to reach for him, to ask if he too felt the growing chasm between them, to recapture the connection they had built so carefully during the autumn. But she found herself afraid that acknowledging the distance might make it permanent, afraid that he would confirm her worst suspicion that perhaps this marriage was indeed merely practical, that the warmth she thought they had shared was only ever meant to be a temporary courtship phase before settling into the cold reality of aristocratic union. And so she remained silent, protecting her increasingly fragile heart while watching the man she had agreed to marry disappear behind the Duke. And as the wedding day approached with inexorable momentum, she felt herself suspended between hope and despair, between the memory of who they had been together in quiet libraries and gardens, and the reality of who they seemed to be becoming under society's relentless gaze. The crisis arrived on a grey December afternoon, during what should have been a routine fitting at Madame Archambault's exclusive establishment on Bond Street, where Eleanor stood upon a raised platform surrounded by mirrors, while seamstresses pinned and adjusted the wedding gown that her mother had commissioned. An elaborate confection of silk and lace that seemed designed to transform Eleanor into something she was not, something grand and ducal and entirely foreign to her nature, and her mother had stepped out briefly to confer with the modist about the veil, leaving Eleanor alone in the fitting room, or so she thought until she heard voices drifting from the adjacent chamber, where the wall did not quite reach the ceiling, and she recognized with a sinking sensation the voice of Lady Pemberton, one of society's most accomplished gossips, speaking in that particular tone of malicious delight that accompanied truly choice speculation. "I must say, I have finally determined the Duke's reasoning," Lady Pemberton announced to her companion, and Eleanor stood frozen upon her platform as the voice continued, each word dropping like poison into her consciousness. "He has chosen her precisely because she is plain and unremarkable, a woman who will never expect love or warmth, or any of the tiresome emotions that more beautiful women might demand. A wife who will be so grateful for the title and position that she will never complain about his coldness, never expect him to exert himself beyond the basic duties of providing an heir." The other woman, whom Eleanor could not identify, murmured something inaudible, and Lady Pemberton laughed, a sound like breaking glass, and continued with evident relish. "It is actually rather clever when one considers it. Miss Hartley is exactly the sort of convenient, undemanding choice that a man like Greystone would make, someone who understands her good fortune and will not have the temerity to expect actual affection from a duke, and she gets to be a duchess, which is far more than someone of her appearance could ever have hoped for. So everyone benefits from the arrangement, and really one cannot fault either party for accepting the practical realities of their situations. Eleanor felt the words strike her with physical force, each syllable confirming the fears that had been growing in her heart throughout the engagement, and she stood trembling upon the platform while the seamstresses continued their work, oblivious to the fact that their client's world was crumbling, and she stared at her reflection in the surrounding mirrors, at her too pale face and unremarkable features, and the elaborate gown that could not transform the plain reality beneath, and thought that perhaps Lady Pemberton was entirely correct, that perhaps she had been desperately foolish to believe that Sebastian's attentions meant anything beyond practical convenience, that perhaps his proposal had nothing to do with the connection she thought they had forged, and everything to do with her being the sort of woman who would not expect or demand the love he was incapable of giving. The fitting continued in a haze of misery as Eleanor mechanically turned when directed and raised her arms when required, while her mind replayed every moment of their courtship through this new and devastating lens, and she saw now how it might all be interpreted not as growing affection, but as calculated selection, how his choice of her might indeed be less about her particular qualities and more about her particular deficits, about choosing someone whose gratitude and low expectations would make her manageable and undemanding. And the worst part was that she could not even fault the logic, for she had accepted his proposal knowing that he had not spoken of love, had told herself that respect and compatibility would suffice, and perhaps she had been participating all along in precisely the transaction that Lady Pemberton described, trading her expectations of love for the security of position, except that somewhere along the way she had been foolish enough to fall genuinely in love with him, while he perhaps had never felt anything beyond mild preference for her company and relief at finding someone who would not require him to feel more. And by the time her mother returned and the fitting concluded and Eleanor was released to return home, she felt hollowed out and uncertain, questioning everything she thought she understood about Sebastian and herself and the marriage she had agreed to enter in just 3 weeks' time. Eleanor retreated behind walls constructed of propriety and self-protection, and in the days following the fitting she found herself unable to meet Sebastian's eyes with the openness that had once characterized their private moments, for every time she looked at him she heard Lady Pemberton's voice dissecting their engagement with such clinical precision, reducing what she had believed might be genuine connection to mere convenient transaction, and so she armored herself in formality and distance, responding to his inquiries with polite brevity, accepting his escort to necessary social functions with correct gratitude but without warmth, maintaining precisely the demeanor of a woman who understood that she was entering a practical arrangement and had no foolish expectations of anything more, and if her heart ached with each careful deflection, if she longed to reach for the intimacy they had begun to build during those autumn weeks, she reminded herself sternly that it was better to protect herself now than to continue building hopes on foundations that Lady Pemberton had revealed to be entirely imaginary. Sebastian noticed the change immediately, for he had become attuned to Eleanor's quieter expressions during their courtship, had learned to read meaning in the subtle shifts of her demeanor, and her sudden retreat into formality struck him with the force of rejection, even as he misinterpreted its cause entirely, assuming that she had come to accept the reality of what their marriage would be, a dignified partnership of mutual respect, but nothing more intimate. And perhaps she had realized that the warmth between them during their private moments had been merely the pleasant prelude to courtship, and that now, approaching the actual reality of ducal marriage with all its attendant obligations and scrutiny, she understood that such warmth must be set aside in favor of appropriate conduct, and if this interpretation wounded something in his chest that he had been carefully not examining too closely, he told himself it was for the best, that he had been foolish to imagine that someone like Eleanor would want anything from him beyond the security and position he could provide, and so he responded to her retreat by reconstructing his own carefully maintained walls, becoming once again the cold Duke of Greystone, who performed his social obligations with perfect correctness and nothing of genuine feeling. Their interactions became exercises in painful courtesy, each maintaining flawless propriety, while the distance between them widened into a chasm that neither knew how to bridge, for Eleanor believed she was protecting herself from eventual heartbreak by accepting the practical nature of their arrangement, while Sebastian believed he was respecting her obvious desire for a proper ducal marriage, unburdened by inappropriate emotional demands. and so they circled each other with exquisite politeness, discussing wedding details and guest lists and settlement arrangements with the detached efficiency of solicitors, negotiating a contract rather than two people preparing to bind their lives together. The wedding preparations continued with relentless momentum, despite the growing misery of both principals, for Eleanor's mother remained oblivious to any tension in her determination to orchestrate a social triumph, and the households of both families moved forward with fittings and menu selections and seating arrangements, while Eleanor and Sebastian participated with mechanical compliance. And during the few moments when they were left alone together, they found they had nothing to say, or rather too much that could not be said, and so they sat in silence that grew more oppressive with each passing day, and Eleanor thought that this must be what the rest of her life would resemble, sitting across from a man she loved, who regarded her with distant courtesy and nothing more, while Sebastian stared at the woman he had asked to be his wife, and felt her slipping away into some unreachable distance, and told himself that this was what he had always expected, that warmth and genuine connection were not meant for men like him, that he should be grateful she was willing to proceed with the marriage at all, and not be greedy for more than she was prepared to offer. And so they drifted toward their wedding day like two ships caught in separate currents, each believing themselves alone in their unhappiness, each protecting a heart that the other would have cherished had they only found the courage to speak. Sebastian stood in his study at Greystone House, staring at the decanter of brandy he had poured, but not yet drunk, while the winter afternoon faded beyond the windows, and the room settled into shadows that he did not bother to dispel by calling for lamps, and he was attempting through sheer force of will to convince himself that the hollow ache in his chest was merely the natural apprehension of a man approaching matrimony, and not the more devastating recognition that he had somehow managed to ruin the best thing that had ever happened to him before it had properly begun. When the door opened without preamble, and Marcus Pemberton, Viscount Ashworth, entered with the easy presumption of a friendship that dated back to their school days, and gave Sebastian one of the few connections in his life that was untainted by calculation or obligation. "You look like hell," Marcus observed with characteristic bluntness, crossing to the fireplace and turning to regard Sebastian with an expression that mingled concern with exasperation, and Sebastian made some dismissive gesture that was meant to discourage further inquiry, but Marcus had never been easily discouraged, and continued with the relentless determination of someone who had decided an intervention was necessary, regardless of its welcome. "I have been watching you these past 2 weeks, watching both of you actually, and I must tell you that if I did not know better, I would assume I was witnessing two people being marched to their executions rather than to the altar, and I cannot stay silent any longer when I see you making the same damned mistake you made 7 years ago, hiding behind duty and propriety and cold correctness, when what is required is honesty and courage, and the willingness to risk your pride for something that actually matters." Sebastian felt something flash through him, anger or panic or perhaps relief that someone had finally named what he had been so carefully not acknowledging, and he turned away from his friend's too perceptive gaze and said with attempted coldness that fooled neither of them, "I have no idea what you mean. The arrangements are proceeding perfectly well, and Miss Hartley has given no indication of any dissatisfaction." But Marcus made a sound of pure frustration and crossed the room to stand directly in Sebastian's line of sight, and said with unusual intensity, "Do you love her, Sebastian? Because I rather think you do. I have seen the way you look at her when you think no one is watching, have seen you actually smile in her presence, which is more than I have witnessed in years, and yet here you are retreating behind your walls and allowing her to retreat behind hers, and pretending that you are both content with some bloodless arrangement of convenience, when anyone with eyes can see that you are both miserable." The words struck Sebastian like physical blows, demolishing the careful edifice of denial he had been constructing, and he felt something crack open in his chest as recognition came flooding through the understanding that Marcus was entirely correct, that somewhere during those autumn weeks of shared conversations and quiet walks and moments of genuine connection, he had fallen utterly and irrevocably in love with Eleanor Hartley, with her intelligence and authenticity, and the way she looked at the world with such careful observation, with her quiet strength and her refusal to perform for society's approval, and the particular quality of peace he felt in her presence. And the realization was both devastating and terrifying, because it meant that he had everything to lose, that if she did not feel the same, then his careful existence would become unendurable, and he found himself sinking into the chair by the fire and saying in a voice that emerged rough and uncertain, "What if she does not want my love? What if she has retreated because she has realized that she cannot bear the thought of actually being bound to me beyond the formal requirements? What if I speak and lose even the cold comfort of her presence?" And Marcus regarded him with something like compassion and said quietly, "And what if you remain silent and lose everything that matters because you were too afraid to risk being hurt? You are making the same mistake you made with Catherine, assuming you know what the other person feels, without ever having the courage to truly ask, except that Eleanor is nothing like Catherine and deserves better than your cowardice, and so do you. You deserve the chance to actually be happy instead of merely correct. But that requires you to be honest about what you feel and brave enough to ask her what she feels in return, and you have exactly 2 days before you bind yourself to her with vows that should mean something more than legal obligation." Sebastian sent the note the following evening requesting the private audience with such formal correctness that Eleanor nearly refused out of sheer self-preservation, but something in the careful script, a slight irregularity in letters that were usually perfectly formed, suggested an unsteadiness that compelled her acceptance, and so she found herself descending into her family's modest garden as twilight deepened into true night. The air, carrying the last warmth of the October day, mingled with the green scent of boxwood and late-blooming roses, and moonlight filtered through the nearly bare branches of the old oak that had witnessed generations of her family's private moments. And Sebastian stood beneath it, with his back to her, his posture rigid with tension that was visible even in silhouette, and when he turned at the sound of her approach, she was struck by the stark vulnerability in his face, all his usual careful control stripped away to reveal something raw and frightened and desperately determined. "Miss Hartley Eleanor," he began, and his voice emerged rough and uncertain in a way she had never heard from the controlled Duke of Greystone, and he took a step toward her and then stopped as though afraid to come closer, and the words that followed came haltingly, unpracticed, as though he was speaking a language he had never been taught and was discovering as he went. "I have spent the past 2 weeks in a particular kind of hell, watching you retreat from me and believing I understood why, believing that you had come to accept that our marriage would be merely a practical arrangement and that the warmth we had begun to build was inappropriate to such an arrangement, and I told myself that I should be grateful you were willing to proceed at all, that I had no right to want more than you were prepared to offer. But then Marcus Viscount Ashworth forced me to examine what I have been so carefully avoiding, acknowledging, and I find I cannot marry you in 2 days' time without speaking this truth, even if it costs me everything, even if you cannot return the feeling, even if it makes the rest of our lives together unbearably awkward." He drew a breath that she could see shake through him, and the moonlight cast shadows across his face that made him look both younger and more careworn, and he continued with increasing intensity, "I love you, Eleanor. I have loved you for weeks, though I was too much a coward to name it even to myself. I love your intelligence and your refusal to perform for others' approval and the way you see the world with such careful attention. I love the peace I feel in your presence and the way you make me wish to be better than the cold creature I have trained myself to become, and I know I have no particular gift for expressing such things. I know I am difficult and withdrawn, and burdened with a title that brings more obligation than joy. But I am asking no. I am begging to know your true feelings, not what you think you should feel or what would be appropriate for a ducal marriage, but what you actually feel in your heart, because I find I cannot bear the thought of binding you to me through duty alone, when what I want, what I desperately want, though I have no right to demand it, is to be chosen by you, not from obligation but from genuine desire. Not because I am a duke who can provide security, but because I am Sebastian, who loves you more than I knew it was possible to love anyone, and so I am asking, Eleanor, will you tell me, truly, could you ever come to care for me as I care for you, or have I ruined everything by being too afraid to speak until it was nearly too late?" His words hung in the night air between them, and Eleanor saw that his hands were trembling slightly at his sides, and she realized that this man, who faced society with such icy control, was standing before her utterly defenseless, having stripped away every protection to offer her his heart, with no guarantee that she would not crush it, and the courage that required the tremendous courage of risking everything when he had already been hurt by someone who had valued him only for what he could provide, struck her with such force that she felt tears spring to her eyes, even as something that had been clenched tight in her chest for 2 weeks suddenly loosened and began to unfurl like a flower turning toward unexpected sun. Eleanor felt the words strike through her like light-piercing clouds that had obscured the sun for so long she had forgotten what warmth felt like, and she realized with sudden clarity that they had been circling the same wound, two people so convinced of their own insufficiency that they could not recognize being genuinely valued. And she moved toward him without conscious decision, closing the distance he had been too afraid to bridge, and when she spoke, her voice emerged thick with tears, but also with something like joy breaking through. "You foolish man, do you truly not know? Have you not seen that I have been in agony these past weeks? That I retreated not because I accepted our arrangement as merely practical, but because I was utterly terrified by how much I had come to feel for you, because I overheard speculation at the dressmakers that you had chosen me precisely because I would be grateful and undemanding, that I was convenient rather than desired, and the words struck every fear I have carried my entire life, that I am too plain to inspire genuine devotion, that any man who married me would be settling for less than what he truly wanted, and I could not bear the thought of loving you with everything in me while you saw me merely as the least troublesome option." And she saw shock register in his face, followed by something that might have been anguish, and she continued with increasing intensity. "I have loved you for weeks, Sebastian, perhaps since that afternoon in the library when you spoke of loneliness, and I recognized in you the same isolation I have known, certainly since you began leaving annotations in the books we shared, and I realized that you actually saw me, that you valued my thoughts rather than merely tolerating them. And I have been so desperately afraid because I have watched beautiful women throw themselves at you for years and you remained unmoved, and I could not understand why you would suddenly want someone like me unless there was some calculation I could not perceive, some reason that had nothing to do with genuine feeling." And now she was close enough to see the unshed brightness in his eyes, and she reached up to touch his face with trembling fingers and said with quiet fierceness, "But I do love you. I love you so much that these past 2 weeks have been a special kind of torture, watching you retreat behind your walls and believing I had no right to scale them, and I have been terrified of loving someone who could never love me back, of spending my life wanting more than you could give. But if you truly mean what you say, if you actually love me not as a convenient choice but as Eleanor, as the woman I am rather than simply as someone who will not make demands upon your emotions, then I choose you with my whole heart. I choose Sebastian rather than the Duke. I choose the man who looks at Greek sculptures with such careful attention and who makes dry observations that make me laugh, and who has shown me more genuine kindness in these months than I have known in years. And yes, I will marry you not from duty, but from desire, not because you can provide security, but because I cannot imagine my life without you in it, because you have become necessary to my happiness in ways I did not know were possible." The last words emerged as barely more than a whisper, and then his hands came up to frame her face with such tenderness that fresh tears spilled down her cheeks, and he said her name like a prayer before lowering his mouth to hers in a kiss that was nothing like the chaste brush of lips that propriety might have permitted, but rather a claiming and a surrender simultaneously, a conversation conducted without words that spoke of hunger and relief, and promises that transcended anything that could be expressed in language. And Eleanor felt herself melt into him as his arms came around her properly for the first time, and she understood with sudden certainty that this recognition of being seen and valued and chosen for exactly who she was what she had been waiting for without knowing it was possible. And when they finally drew apart, they were both trembling and breathless, and Sebastian pressed his forehead to hers and said roughly, "We have been such fools, both of us, so convinced of our own unworthiness that we nearly destroyed the best thing either of us has ever found." And Eleanor laughed through her tears and said, "Then let us be fools no longer. Let us be brave enough to trust what we have discovered." And they stood wrapped in each other beneath the old oak tree, as moonlight painted silver patterns through the branches, and the night air carried the scent of roses and the particular sweetness of understanding finally achieved. And Eleanor thought that perhaps being overlooked for so long had been necessary precisely so she would recognize true value when it appeared, and that the plainness society had judged her for was actually clarity, the ability to see past surfaces to what genuinely mattered. And that gift had allowed her to perceive the extraordinary man hidden beneath the cold Duke's exterior, just as his similar gift had allowed him to perceive her worth when others saw only unremarkable appearance, and their matching wounds had become their strength rather than their weakness, because they understood each other's fears without requiring explanation. And as Sebastian held her as though she was precious beyond measure, Eleanor felt something fundamental shift in how she understood herself, felt the years of believing she was insufficient finally begin to release their hold, replaced by the revolutionary recognition that she was enough, had always been enough, had simply been waiting for someone who possessed the wisdom to see it. The morning of the wedding arrived with November, sunlight slanting through high windows in a quality of light that seemed almost sacramental, as though the world itself recognized the solemnity of what was about to occur, and Eleanor stood in her chamber as her mother fastened the final buttons of her gown, not the elaborate confection of silk and lace that had been originally planned, but a simpler dress of ivory satin that Eleanor had quietly insisted upon, elegant in its restraint, beautiful in a way that felt true to who she actually was rather than who society might have wanted her to become. And when she looked at her reflection, she saw not the plain wallflower who had begun the season in resignation, but a woman whose face bore the unmistakable radiance of being genuinely loved, and she thought how strange it was that happiness should prove so much more transformative than any amount of rouge or elaborate coiffure could ever accomplish. The ceremony itself took place not in the grand cathedral that a duke's wedding typically demanded, but in the smaller chapel Sebastian had requested, with only family and closest friends in attendance. And as Eleanor walked down the aisle on her father's arm, she saw Sebastian waiting at the altar with an expression of such unguarded emotion that several guests drew in audible breaths. For the Duke of Greystone had entirely abandoned his usual icy composure and stood watching her approach as though she was something miraculous. And when she reached him and he took her hand, his fingers trembled slightly against hers, and he whispered for her ears alone, "You are so beautiful." And she knew he meant it, in the way that truly mattered, and the vows they spoke carried a weight of genuine meaning that made them feel less like recitation and more like sacred promises. And when the vicar pronounced them married and Sebastian kissed her, it was with a tenderness that made several ladies reach for handkerchiefs, while others whispered that they had never seen the Duke look so utterly transformed. The reception that followed in the garden of Sebastian's London residence proved equally remarkable, not for its grandeur, though everything was elegant and tastefully arranged, but for the unmistakable happiness that radiated from the esposa, bride and groom. For Sebastian kept Eleanor's hand in his throughout the afternoon, and smiled at her with such frequency that his usual stern expression seemed to belong to a different man entirely, and Eleanor laughed with a freedom she had never displayed in society before, and guests who had come prepared to whisper about the oddness of the match, instead found themselves unexpectedly moved by the genuine devotion so plainly visible between husband and wife, and Lady Hartwell remarked to her companion that she had attended perhaps 50 weddings in her life, but never one where the couple seemed so perfectly suited or so obviously in love, and even the most cynical observers had to acknowledge that whatever the Duke's reasons for choosing Eleanor Hartley, they clearly had nothing to do with convenience or settling for less than what he wanted. And as twilight settled over the garden, and Sebastian led Eleanor inside toward the carriage that would take them to Greystone Manor for their wedding trip, she turned back once to look at the assembled guests and felt a profound gratitude, not for the title or the security or any of the practical advantages the marriage provided, but for the extraordinary gift of being chosen by someone who saw her clearly and loved what he saw. And Sebastian handed her into the carriage and settled beside her, and took her hand again, as though already accustomed to the right to touch her freely, and as they drove away from London toward their future together, Eleanor thought that their real life was only now beginning, that everything before had been merely preparation for this moment of finally becoming who they were meant to be, together. 3 years had passed, with the particular swiftness that characterizes time spent in genuine contentment, and the early autumn afternoon found Eleanor in Sebastian's study at Greystone Manor, the country estate that had become their true home, seated at the desk they now shared, annotating a manuscript while he stood at the window reviewing correspondence, and the easy silence between them held the comfortable quality of two people who had long since ceased to need constant conversation to feel connected. And when she shifted in her chair to ease the growing weight she carried, He glanced over immediately with that particular expression of concern mixed with wonder that had become habitual these past months, and she smiled at him with the quiet assurance that came from knowing herself thoroughly loved, and he crossed to her and placed his hand gently on the curve where their child grew, and said with soft amazement as he did nearly every day, "I still cannot quite believe this is real, that you are mine and we have built this life together." And she covered his hand with hers and replied, "We are each other's, and yes, somehow we have managed to create something I never imagined possible when I stood by those ballroom windows, convinced I would spend my life alone." And he kissed her forehead and returned to his work, and Eleanor reflected on how their reputation had transformed in society's eyes from the inexplicable cold match to the unexpected love story, for they had been observed together at enough functions that even the most skeptical had been forced to acknowledge the devotion so plainly evident between them, and invitations to Greystone were now sought after because guests recognized they would witness something increasingly rare, a marriage characterized by genuine partnership and affection, and Eleanor had discovered that being valued by Sebastian had somehow made her visible to others in new ways, though she cared far less about society's opinion now that she possessed what actually mattered, and she thought how strange and wonderful it was that the very qualities that had made her unmarketable as a debutante, her intelligence, her directness, her refusal to perform, were precisely what Sebastian had needed, and his similar qualities that society had judged as coldness had been protection around a heart that felt deeply but had learned to guard itself, and they had recognized each other across a crowded ballroom, not despite their wounds but because of them, and that recognition had become the foundation for everything they had built together. Dear reader, perhaps you too have stood in spaces where you felt invisible, have been judged by surfaces and found wanting, have wondered if the particular shape of who you are could ever be valued rather than merely tolerated. And if so, let this story offer you a different truth, that real love possesses a singular gift for recognizing what others overlook, that the plainest choices by society's shallow measures can prove the most beautiful by the only standard that ultimately matters, which is genuine connection between two people who see each other clearly and love what they see. And the greatest courage is not in making yourself acceptable to those who judge by appearance, but in remaining authentically yourself, until someone with the wisdom to perceive true value finally arrives. For Sebastian and Eleanor might have spent their lives alone, if either had tried to become what society expected rather than staying true to who they actually were, and their stubborn authenticity, despite its social cost, was precisely what allowed them to recognize their perfect match when they encountered it. And so, if you find yourself dismissed or overlooked, consider that you may simply be waiting for the rare individual perceptive enough to see past surfaces to substance, and those individuals are worth waiting for because connection built on genuine recognition of who you are will always prove more sustaining than any amount of attention based on performance or pretense. And may you find what Eleanor and Sebastian discovered: someone who makes you more yourself rather than less, who sees your particular shape and calls it beautiful, who chooses you not despite your plainness, but because your clarity and theirs create something luminous together. And may you have the courage to wait for that real thing, rather than accepting lesser substitutes. And may you rest tonight in the knowledge that somewhere there exists someone who will look at you the way Sebastian looked at Eleanor across that ballroom, seeing not what society dismisses, but what actually matters. And may that meeting come to you with perfect timing, and may you recognize it when it arrives, and may your life be rich with the kind of love that transforms wounds into wisdom and loneliness into belonging. And may you always remember that being overlooked by those who cannot perceive value is no measure of your worth. And may you find peace in knowing that authentic connection, when it finally comes, will be worth every moment you spent waiting. And may your rest be sweet and your dreams full of hope.